One of the greatest influences that the Elric saga had on Dungeons and Dragons is the inspiration of the alignment system. It is in these books where the concepts of the axis of good and evil and axis of law and chaos are introduced. In fact, there is some debate as to what Elric's alignment is. As the Deities and Demigods book have him listed, he is chaotic evil. However, both Frank Menser and Gary Gygax have stated in the past that Elric is chaotic neutral. So, as we read these books, perhaps it would be interesting to decide for yourself. What alignment do you think Elric is? And now begins Chapter 3. Riding through the morning, a morning of tranquility. The light of the early morning touched the tall towers of Amir and made them scintillate. Each tower was a different hue. There were 1,000 soft colors. There were rose pinks and pollen yellows. There were purples and pale greens, mauves and browns and oranges, hazy blues, whites and powdery golds, all lovely in the sunlight. 2 riders left the dreaming city behind them and rode away from the walls, over the green turf towards a pine forest where, among the shadowy trunks, a little of the night seemed to remain. Squirrels were stirring, and foxes crept homeward. Birds were singing, and the forest flowers opened their petals and filled the air with delicate scent. A few insects wandering sluggishly aloft. The contrast between life in the nearby city and the lazy rusticity was very great, and seemed to mirror some of the contrasts existing in the mind of at least one of the riders, who was now dismounted and led his horse. Walking knee-deep through a mass of blue flowers, the other rider, a girl, brought her own horse to a halt, but did not dismount. Instead, she leaned casually on her high Melnibonean pommel and smiled at the man, her lover. "Elric, would you stop so near to Amir?" He smiled back at her over his shoulder. "For the moment, our flight was hasty. I would collect my thoughts before we ride on." "How did you sleep last night?" "Well enough, Cimmerl, though I must have dreamed without knowing it, for there were little intimations in my head when I awoke. But then, the meeting of Irkun was not pleasant. Do you think he plots to use sorcery against you?" Elric shrugged. "I would know if he brought a large sorcery against me. And he knows my power. I doubt if he would dare employ wizardry. He has reason to believe you might not use your power. He was worried at your personality for so long. If there's not a danger, he will begin to worry at your skills, testing your sorcery as he has tested your patience." Elric frowned. "Yes, I suppose there is that danger, but not yet. I should have thought. He will not be happy until you are destroyed, Elric. Or is destroyed himself, Cymoril. Elric stooped, picked one of the flowers. He smiled. Your brother is inclined to absolutes, is he not? How the weak hate weakness. Cymoril took his meaning. She dismounted and came towards him. Her thin gown matched almost perfectly the color of the flowers through which she moved. He handed her the flower, and she accepted it, touching its petals with her perfect lips. And how the strong hate strength, my love. Irkun is my kin, and yet I give you this advice. Use your strength against him. I could not slay him. I have not the right. Elric's face fell into familiar brooding lines. You could exile him. Is not exile the same as death to a Melnibonean? You yourself have talked of traveling in the lands of the young kingdoms. Elric laughed somewhat bitterly. But perhaps I am not a true Melnibonean. Irkun has said as much, and others echo his thoughts. He hates you because you are contemplative. Your father was contemplative, and no one denied that he was a fitting emperor. My father chose not to put the results of his contemplation into his personal actions. He ruled as an emperor should. Irkun, I must admit, would also rule as an emperor should. He, too, has the opportunity to make Melnibone great again. If he were emperor, he would embark on a campaign of conquest to restore our trade to its former value, to extend our power across the earth. And that is what the majority of folk would wish. Is it my right to deny that wish? It is your right to do what you think, for you are the emperor. All who are loyal to you think as I do. Perhaps their loyalty is misguided. Perhaps Irkun is right, and I will betray that loyalty. Bring doom to the Dragon Isle. His moody, crimson eyes looked directly into hers. Perhaps I should have died as I left my mother's womb. Then Irkun would have become emperor. Has fate been thwarted? Fate is never thwarted. What has happened because fate willed it thus. If indeed there is such a thing as fate, and if men's actions are not merely a response to others' men's actions. Elric drew a deep breath and offered her an expression tinged with irony. Your logic leads you close to heresy, Cymoril. If we are to believe the traditions of Melnibone, perhaps it would be better if you forgot your friendship with me. She laughed. You begin to sound like my brother. Are you testing my love for you, my lord? He began to remount his horse. No, Cymoril, but I would advise you to test your love yourself, for I sense there is tragedy implicit in our love. As she swung herself back into her saddle, she smiled and shook her head. You see doom in all things. Can you not accept the good gifts granted you? There are few enough, my lord. I'll agree with that. They turned in their saddles, hearing hoofbeats behind them. Some distance away, they saw a company of yellow-clad horsemen riding about in confusion. It was their guard. which they had left behind, wishing to ride alone. "Come," cried Elric, "through the woods and over yonder hill. They'll never find us."